For Learning Unit 1, we had done a rather long video that was an introduction, and we're now moving on to Learning Unit 2 and 3. And what I want to do with that is share a slideshow with you and give you a brief background. So most of the information will come from your campus lecturers. Learning Unit 2 and 3 is combined, and this deals with how legislation is passed and promulgated, and also the demise of legislation. So in other words, once legislation becomes valid, so it's an act and it applies, it stays there until somehow it's taken away again. It just doesn't just disappear. So it's about how does it get to be an act and how does it stop being an act. The first part, how legislation is passed and promulgated, I've asked that you watch this video. It was created by Lee Padiachi, who was previously a lecturer at one of the VC campuses. It's a really useful and informative video that you can find on YouTube, and that covers it perfectly. So I want to then move on to just explaining a few of the principles and the terminology that you need to understand. So the adoption process is the process of passing legislation. That is what you've been through once you've watched this video. Then, in order for legislation to become binding, to be valid, to apply, it has to be promulgated. So that's also called the commencement. That's when you can start enforcing it. And publication is a requirement for the commencement. So it can be published either in the Government Gazette if it's national legislation. If it's provincial legislation, then it's published in the Provincial Gazette. And the reason for this is to make laws accessible to the public. You can't very well expect somebody to comply with the law if they don't know what the law is. There's an exception to the requirement of publication, which is when it's impossible to publish, then it can be promulgated by other means. In other words, like we've recently seen with the state of disaster and the regulations, which is a form of secondary legislation that's been made in terms of the Disaster Act. So instead of the government printers actually printing each gazette, it was possible for government to publish those regulations in a different way. And in this case, what you saw was the president would come and make a speech, which is available to the whole country on TV, on the internet, in the newspapers, and that is how most of those regulations were promulgated, were published so that they could commence. So when does it become a law? When is it in force? When does it start applying? The default is that on the date that it's promulgated or published in the Government Gazette or announced by the President in this exceptional case, then that is the date on which it comes into effect. It can also be delayed, and it would then apply either on a future specified date, or it can say a commencement date will be announced later. So it would then be on whichever date is announced at a later stage. It can be done on an earlier date, and that is either retroactive or retrospective. But that is the exception to the rule because there is a presumption that applies, and that is that legislation only applies to the future. So there are exceptions to that, and in order to determine whether legislation that is backdated applies retroactively or retrospectively, we need to go and examine what happens. In Bereki, there was a test formulated by the court, and there you see it. This is not in your textbook, so you need to pay attention to it. If it's retroactive, it has what we call true or strong retro effect, and if it's retrospective, it's weak. So when it's strong, when it's retroactive, it invalidates what was previously valid and the other way around. So it kind of requires us to deem that something was, but it wasn't really. So there's a deeming clause that comes into operation here. It also affects transactions which were already completed before this came into operation. So it essentially changes not only the law, but the effect of actions in the past. That's the true or strong retroactive aspect. Or it could be retrospective. That's just a weak retro effect. So the legislation is backdated, and it imposes new results with regard to past events, and it attaches new consequences for the future to an event which took place before the legislation was enacted. So it creates new obligations, it imposes new duties in regards to events that had taken place in the past. The best example of that is Section 7 of the Children's Act, which changed the age of majority from 21 to 18 back in 27, and I'll go into a little bit more detail there in a moment. And an example of a retroactive piece of legislation would be the Terrorism Act, and this act was deemed to have been in force 5 years before it was actually passed and promulgated. So let's have a look how retrospective legislation works. On the 1st of July 27, the Children's Act changed so that instead of becoming a major and having, for instance, the ability to enter into a contract, changed to 18 instead of 21. So now remember that in those, on the 1st of July 27, there were a lot of people who were 18, 19, 20, and almost 21 years old. Now, at that point, 19-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, and 20-year-olds, and everybody up till a day before their 21st birthday were regarded as minors. They could not enter into a contract without the assistance of a parent or a guardian. So that is 4 years worth of young people who suddenly, overnight, in July 27, gained their majority. So they all became majors on that date. And any act that, let's say, somebody who's now 20 years old, and in 2006, they entered into a contract. That contract would have been regarded as invalid because they were a minor unless they had the assistance of their parents or guardians. Suddenly, they're now a major. So suddenly, that contract is now valid. So can you see how the consequences of what they did in the past now changes? That is how retrospective legislation works. There are exceptions to the rule that legislation always only applies to the future, and the first exception is whether retroactive legislation does no harm, then it doesn't apply. So An example would be, we change the maximum sentence for a crime from imprisonment to 6 months imprisonment. So then it can work back because it benefits the person. It does not prejudice them in any way. And where it affects procedure, that would also be an example of where the retroactive part does not apply.